On the 7th of October, 1941, the operational duty officer at the headquarters of the Western Front received a report that did not fit into any of the schemes hanging on the walls. German mobile columns had been spotted east of the Vyazma, not to the west, to the east. This meant one thing: the encirclement ring had already closed. 5 Soviet armies, 700,000 men with artillery, supply trains, and field hospitals found themselves inside. At that moment, the Western Front headquarters was requesting evacuation to Mozhaisk. The units that were supposed to cover these armies from the flanks had been withdrawing for several hours already, and inside the cauldron, people were still carrying out orders transmitted from a headquarters that no longer existed as a combat unit. The main question of the Vyazma catastrophe is not why the Germans managed to encircle such forces. The question is why the Soviet command did not see a single one of the signals that, several days before the strike, lay on the desks of intelligence officers, came from captured German documents, and were written in the reports of frontline observers. To understand this, one must return to the end of September 41, to where the catastrophe was only just gathering. In the autumn of 1941, the German Eastern Front faced serious problems that were not customarily spoken of aloud. Army Group Center under Field Marshal von Bock had advanced from the border to Smolensk, losing equipment, men, and, most importantly, momentum in the summer battles. The Army Group had become bogged down near Smolensk from July to September. Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, had gone south to encircle Kiev. Tank engines had covered thousands of kilometers without proper maintenance. The Luftwaffe suffered losses that were carefully underreported in summaries. By the end of September, the German High Command, OKW, realized a simple thing. If Moscow was not taken before the real frosts, the campaign of 1941 would remain unfinished. And an unfinished campaign meant wintering in open positions without winter equipment, which had not been delivered in haste because the planners of Barbarossa believed the war would end by October. That is why, on the 26th of September 1941, von Bock received the directive to conduct Operation Typhoon. The objective, Moscow. The deadline, before the onset of winter. The plan was simple and brutal at the same time. 3 panzer groups would strike along converging axes, form cauldrons near Vyazma and Bryansk, destroy the Soviet armies there, after which infantry, under the cover of armor, would advance directly to Moscow along the Minsk and Warsaw highways. The distance from the front line to Moscow was about 300 kilometers. By the standards of the summer of 41, 2 to 3 days for tank columns. For Operation Typhoon, von Bock concentrated 78 divisions, of which 14 were panzer and motorized. This amounted to about 1,800,000 soldiers, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 guns and mortars, and about 1,300 aircraft. By this time, Army Group Center represented the most powerful ground force grouping in the history of wars, not in the number of divisions, but in the concentration of armor and aviation on a narrow operational axis. Guderian had returned from the south again. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group and Hopner's 4th Panzer Group were aimed at Vyazma from the northwest and southwest. Standing against this blow were 3 Soviet fronts. The Western Front under the command of Colonel General Konev, 6 armies along the Rzhev-Vyazma axis. The Reserve Front under the command of Marshal Budyonny, 4 armies of the 2nd Echelon, positioned directly east of Konev's positions. The Bryansk Front under the command of Colonel General Yeremenko covered the southern flank, protecting Tula and Oryol. In total, 67 Soviet divisions, 1,250 tanks, and about 1,100 aircraft. On paper, the force ratio looked tolerable. In reality, everything was more complicated. Soviet divisions in the autumn of 41 were organizations with the title division, but with a substance that did not correspond to the word. After the summer losses, the average division of the Western Front numbered from 3,000 to 7,000 men, instead of the authorized 14,000. Artillery regiments had 15 to 20 guns instead of 50 or 60. There was a catastrophic shortage of anti-tank guns. Soviet industry had not yet had time to replace the equipment losses suffered during the 3 months of retreat. Factories were only being relocated eastward. There were ammunition supplies for about a month of moderate fighting. Fuel, significantly less than the German standard. And with all this, the front stretched for about 350 kilometers. Konev understood the weakness of his positions. The commander of the Western Front had already in the 20s of September requested reinforcements from Moscow, an increase in anti-tank artillery, and the transfer of aircraft. The responses were vague. The General Staff and Stalin personally did not consider the Moscow direction a priority. The attention of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief in September 41 was directed to the south, where near Kiev, the defeat of another grouping of Soviet troops was already underway. Konev received part of what he requested, but far from everything and not on time. And yet, it was here, at this point, that the commander of the Western Front made a mistake that cost more than any shortage of equipment. The mistake was not a lack of courage or weakness of will. The mistake was in the interpretation of intelligence data. By the end of September, Soviet intelligence, both military and agent, had recorded the transfer of German formations to the front line. Reconnaissance aircraft reported concentrations of motorized columns on the roads west of the Vyazma. Intercepted German communications indicated increased headquarters traffic activity. Captured prisoners from various divisions gave numbers that, when combined, made it clear. A strike force was concentrating here. All this data lay on the desks of the Western Front headquarters. Konev and his staff drew a conclusion that seemed logical. The Germans were preparing for local attacks to improve their positions before winter. The idea that the enemy, exhausted by summer battles, was capable of a large-scale strategic offensive with the approaching autumn, with its mud, short days, and stretched communications, seemed an exaggeration. Konev was not a coward and not a fool. He was a commander who saw what he wanted to see, an army as tired as his own. The calculation proved incorrect. On the 30th of September 1941, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group struck the Bryansk front. The direction, Oryol. By the end of the first day, German tanks had advanced 50 kilometers. Yeremenko requested help. Moscow reacted with delay. Yeremenko sent one tank brigade with an incomplete complement of machines into a counterattack. The brigade was stopped by German anti-tank artillery and aircraft. Orel fell on the 2nd of October, while trams were still running in the city. On the 2nd of October, the German offensive unfolded along the entire front line. Guderian's 3rd Panzer Group struck from the north at the junction between the Soviet 30th and 19th Armies. Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group struck from the southwest at the junction between Konev's 20th Army and Budyonny's 24th Army. Both blows fell precisely on the seams, where one commander's responsibility ended and another's began. These junctions had the fewest troops and the least anti-tank defenses. Junctions are the eternal Achilles heel of defense. Every commander fortifies the center of his sector and the flanks of his formations, but the boundary between two fronts or two armies always becomes a zone of reduced attention. German intelligence worked professionally. The disposition of Soviet formations, communication lines, headquarters locations, all of this was plotted on German maps with sufficient accuracy. That is why the blows fell not on the well-fortified positions head-on, but where there were almost no positions. For the first 2 days, the Soviet side did not understand the scale of what was happening. Konev's headquarters received reports of breakthroughs, withdrawals of individual units, and communication breakdowns. Each report on its own looked like a local nuisance. Taken together, they formed a picture of catastrophe, but the headquarters worked with a delay. Radio communications were disrupted by German jamming, telephone lines were cut by aerial bombardment, and liaison officers could not reach the headquarters in time as the roads were already being swept by German units. On the 3rd of October, Konev reported to Moscow that the situation was serious, but under control. This was incorrect. The German 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups were already advancing into the operational depth, bypassing centers of Soviet resistance, avoiding battles for villages and towns. Guderian was moving east through Kolmzherkovsky. Hupner was moving east through Yukhnov. Both were aiming for the same point, Vyazma, a major railway junction and the main transportation hub of the Soviet defense on the Moscow axis. If Vyazma fell, all roads to Moscow would be open. On the 4th of October, Moscow understood the real scale of the breakthrough for the first time. It was then that Stalin summoned Zhukov, who was commanding the Leningrad front, and ordered him to fly immediately to the Western Front. Zhukov arrived at the Western Front headquarters in Krasnovidovo late in the evening of the 4th of October and found a scene he would later describe in his memoirs. Communication with the armies was virtually non-existent. The exact position of the troops was unknown. Staff maps had not been updated for several hours, and Konev had not slept for 2 days. Zhukov tried to restore communication with the armies. Some armies did not respond. Others responded with incomplete information. On the 5th of October, a Soviet pilot performing a reconnaissance flight over the Yukhnov area reported something that at first no one wanted to take seriously. A motorized German column more than 20 kilometers long was moving along the Warsaw Highway towards Moscow. There were no Soviet troops between this column and Moscow on that route. The distance to the capital was about 200 kilometers. The report was received, double-checked, and confirmed by a second crew. This was the vanguard of Hupner's corps, which had already passed through the breach in the front. In Moscow, the report was met with the only available response. The cadets of the Podolsk military schools were hastily mobilized. 12,000 young men, with only a few months left until graduation, were thrown onto the Maloyaroslavets line with orders to delay the German columns at any cost. They did everything they could. The cadets held their positions on the Ugra River for almost 2 weeks. Out of 12,000, about 3,500 remained in the ranks. They bought time that did not exist. On the 7th of October, units of Guderian's 3rd Panzer Group advancing from the north and units of Hopner's 4th Panzer Group advancing from the south met east of Vyazma near the village of Kolmzherkovsky. The cauldron snapped shut. Inside were the 19th Army of Lukin, the 20th Army of Yershov, the 24th Army of Rakutin, and the 32nd Army of Vishnevsky. To them were added parts of the disintegrated reserve group of armies of Budyonny. In total, from 550,000 to 660,000 men, over 1,000 guns and several hundred tanks. The encirclement was incomplete in the first hours. The ring still had gaps. On the night of the 7th to the 8th of October, several columns of Soviet troops attempted to escape the cauldron through the emerging gaps. Some succeeded, most did not. By the morning of the 8th of October, German infantry and motorized rifle units had closed all the main passages. The ring became solid. To understand what was happening inside this ring, one must look away from maps and operational diagrams and see what the cauldron looked like from the battalion level. 500,000 men in an area roughly 70 by 90 kilometers does not mean every meter of this space was filled with troops. It meant that every road, every country track, every bridge over a forest stream was jammed with columns moving in different directions, sometimes towards each other, without overall command, because command collapsed on the very first day of the encirclement. Division and corps commanders tried to contact Army headquarters. Army headquarters tried to contact the front headquarters. The front headquarters had by then already withdrawn eastward, outside the cauldron. Actual command and control of the troops inside the Vyazma pocket ceased around the 9th or 10th of October. After that, each unit acted independently, based on what its commander saw within a radius of a few kilometers. In the forests near Vyazma, the autumn of 1941 was wet, cold, with night frosts and daytime rains that turned dirt roads into channels of liquid clay. Wheeled vehicles could not move, horse-drawn carts sank up to their hubs. Tractors towing howitzers stalled where their fuel ran out. There was almost no fuel inside the cauldron. The last supply convoys had passed through several days before the encirclement, not yet knowing it would happen. Food ran out faster than commanders thought. Divisional depots, which battalion commanders counted on, had not been replenished for a week. Everything available was used immediately. The medical service operated under conditions that would be more accurately described as the absence of service. There was a shortage of medicines, a shortage of bandages, and the evacuation of the wounded was impossible. The seriously wounded were left behind at the first lag of a column. Sometimes they were left not because they wanted to abandon them, but because there was no one and nothing to carry them with. Breakout attempts were made almost continuously from the 8th to the 12th of October. The commander of the 19th Army, Lieutenant General Lukin, organized attacks on German blocking positions several times a day. The Germans responded with artillery fire and aircraft. By this time, Soviet units had almost no anti-aircraft guns left. They had been lost in the first days of the operation. German assault aircraft operated over the cauldron practically unopposed. Columns assembled for a breakthrough strike were scattered by bombardments before the attack could even begin. One of the few who managed to organize a more or less stable breakout attempt was Lieutenant General Lukin. On the night of the 18th to the 19th of October, the remnants of the 19th Army made a final coordinated breakthrough in the Bogoroditskoye area. The assault group numbered several thousand men. The breakthrough was partially successful. About 500 men passed through the German positions. Lukin himself was severely wounded, taken prisoner unconscious, and lost a leg in a German field hospital. He spent 3 years and 4 months in captivity. The fate of Mikhail Lukin is one of those stories that reflect not only personal tragedy, but also the logic of the system in which people became hostages. An army commander who, under real conditions, did almost everything possible, maintained resistance for several weeks where there should have been none at all, and ultimately emerged from this war as a disabled veteran and former prisoner of war. After his liberation, he was not shot, and on this basis, some historians conclude that Stalin understood his position. In reality, Stalin simply had enough other army commanders whom he could shoot for lesser offenses. While the cauldron near Vyazma still held, something else was approaching Moscow, what Soviet documents of the time called panic sentiment, and foreign correspondents described more accurately, evacuation chaos that grew into a mass exodus. On the 16th of October 1941, when a rumor spread through the city that the government had already left Moscow, metro stations were shut down, factories began burning documents, some shops were looted, and a traffic jam formed on the Minsk highway with cars heading east. What happened on the 16th of October is a separate topic that deserves its own discussion. But for understanding the Vyazma catastrophe, the following is important. The Moscow panic was a direct consequence of what had happened near Vyazma. If the 5 armies had held or at least slowed the German breakthrough by a week, Moscow would have had more time to organize its defense. If Budyonny's reserve front had not been cut simultaneously with Konev's western front, the Mozhaisk defense line would have had time to be occupied by troops. The Mozhaisk defense line was a line that the Soviet command had begun preparing back in the summer of '41, and on which it placed serious hopes. 4 fortified districts, Volokholamsk, Mozhaisk, Maloyaroslavets, and Kaluga. Anti-tank ditches, bunkers, minefields, all of this existed. But by the time German tanks broke out of the Vyazma pocket to the east, catastrophically few troops were stationed on the line itself. The garrisons of the fortified districts were under strength. The rifle units that were supposed to occupy the positions were either trapped in the cauldron or retreating in scattered groups. A People's Militia Division was holding a line designed for a regular rifle division with full armament. Zhukov, who assumed command of the Western Front on the 10th of October, worked with what he had. This was the bare minimum, not a choice. One simply worked with it. Reserves were urgently moving from Moscow. Divisions from the Far East, cadets from military schools, units of the Moscow garrison. They were thrown onto the Mozhaisk line as they arrived, without proper deployment, without coordination with the terrain, often without maps. The commanders of these units saw the terrain for the first time. Initially, there was no communication between neighboring formations. All of this was extremely vulnerable. German commanders von Bock, Gott, Hoppner, Guderian, during those same days noted in their journals something that did not fit the image of an easy victory. The roads had turned to mud. The pace of the advance had slowed. Units that had gone through the cauldron battles required rest and replenishment. The Luftwaffe was limited by bad weather. Low cloud cover, fog, and autumn rains made massive strikes impossible. Logistics were cracking. Fuel for tanks arrived a day late, sometimes two. Guderian wrote that his 2nd Panzer Army was receiving fuel by the drop, yet it was required to fight at the same pace as before. Here lies one of the key paradoxes of the Vyazma catastrophe. The Germans had achieved perhaps the most impressive tactical victory of 1941. The number of captured prisoners and trophy weapons was enormous. The road to Moscow was open. But precisely this encirclement and destruction of 5 Soviet armies took time that, in another situation, the Germans would have spent advancing forward. While the battles for the cauldrons were ongoing, while security divisions ground down the remnants of the encircled forces, while staff officers counted the trophies, the precious October days were slipping away, and each of these days was used by the Soviet side to move new forces toward Moscow. The depth of the German strategic breakthrough was overwhelming, but precisely this depth was becoming an increasing problem. The farther the tank columns moved from Smolensk, the longer the supply routes became, the worse communication worked, and the harder it was to secure the flanks. Soviet units, which, according to all calculations of Army Group Center headquarters, should have collapsed long ago, continued to resist on secondary directions, threatening the flanks of the German columns. Partisan units, which began forming in the very first days of the occupation, intercepted small convoys and sabotaged communications. All of these were minor details on the scale of an army, but details that added up. On the 13th of October, German troops took Kaluga, bypassing it from the north. On the 14th, Rzhev. On the 15th, Kalinin. The ring around Moscow was slowly but surely tightening. The strategic situation was objectively critical, but it was precisely in these days that Stalin made several decisions that he later did not like to discuss very much. First, Stalin remained in Moscow. The government was evacuated to Kuibyshev. The diplomatic corps went there as well, and some central departments also left. Stalin personally went to the platform of the Kazan railway station, stood for a while, and returned to the Kremlin. According to available information, the train was ready, the security was ready. The decision was not made. This decision, to stay, had a very specific psychological effect on the defense of Moscow. The news spread through the city that Stalin was in Moscow. The panic began to subside. Second, it was precisely in these days that the order was given for the arrest and execution of the commander of the Western Front, Konev. Zhukov personally petitioned Stalin for Konev to remain as his deputy. Stalin agreed. Konev was not shot. A few months later, he received a new appointment and later, rehabilitation in the eyes of the military leadership. Budyani was relieved of command of the Reserve Front calmly, without tragic consequences for his biography. The marshal had 2 long-standing and strong connections in Stalin's innermost circle. The third decision concerned information. The Soviet press of that time reported on the battles in the Moscow direction using phrasing that did not allow for an understanding of the real scale of events. The word encirclement was not used. The word cauldron was not used. Heavy defensive battles, that was all that was reported. The number of prisoners captured by the Germans was not acknowledged by the Soviet side, neither in official reports nor in post-war publications. The figures openly stated by the German side, 660,000 prisoners, 1,200 guns, more than 300 tanks, either did not appear at all in Soviet sources or were reduced to a level that did not allow for an understanding of the real losses. This information policy had practical consequences. Soviet citizens and a portion of Soviet commanders did not have a real picture of what had happened in October 41. This meant that each time positions were breached, when units found themselves encircled, when communications were cut, the first several hours were spent trying to understand what exactly was happening. There was no established algorithm of action for encirclement, because the very fact of encirclement was not officially recognized as a real tactical situation, only as a temporary difficulty that needed to be immediately eliminated by a decisive strike. Inside the Vyazma cauldron, soldiers and commanders in the first days did not know for certain that they were surrounded. They knew that communication with neighboring units had been lost, that the rear services were not responding, that German units were outflanking them. But the category of encirclement in the statutory Soviet military doctrine of 1941 did not have a clear description of actions. The regulations prescribed, when an attempt is made to encircle, destroy the encircling force with a decisive counterblow. What to do if the cauldron had already closed, the regulations did not explain. As a result, commanders acted each according to their own judgment. Some immediately began to break out to the east, losing a third of their personnel but still getting out. Others tried to dig in within forested areas and wait for help from outside, gradually losing people to hunger and daily German attacks. Still others divided their units into small groups that went into the forests and continued resistance as partisan detachments. Others, depleted, without ammunition, without food, after several days without sleep, accepted surrender. The number of Soviet prisoners of war captured by the German side during the Vyazma and Bryansk operations in October-November 1941, according to German data, amounted to about 660,000 men at Vyazma alone. The Bryansk cauldron added another about 100,000. In total, about 750,000 men. This was the largest German tactical victory on the Soviet-German front in terms of the number of prisoners captured in a single operation. The fate of these prisoners is a separate tragedy, which unfolded already outside the framework of the military battle itself. By the end of 41, beginning of 42, a significant portion of them had perished. The German system of prisoner of war camps, which ultimately became a machine of destruction, was only just taking shape at the end of 1941, but the mortality rate within it was already catastrophic. Hunger, cold, lack of medical care, executions of political officers and Jews, all this occurred in the transit camps and stages that the German side called dulags and stalags. Stalin knew about the losses. Not all figures were accurate even for him, because the Soviet system of military accounting in October 41 was in a state that could hardly be called a system. Units caught in encirclement fell out of the accounting. Commanders who broke out of the cauldron with remnants of their formations reported to various headquarters, and the same men could be listed both as out of action and as having broken through. The real cost of the Vyazma disaster has not been definitively established to this day. One thing was clear immediately. The Vyazma disaster meant that there were no more reserves for the initial plan of Moscow's defense. The forces that were planned to be on the Mozhaisk line by the 1st of November no longer existed. In their place stood something else, weaker, hastily assembled, heterogeneous. It was with this that Zhukov met the continuation of the German offensive. It was from this exposed nerve that the defense of Moscow later grew, which, contrary to the logic of military science, held. Why it held is a question that has no single answer. Several factors played a role, each of which individually was not decisive, but together they created a critical mass. First, the German units were also exhausted. The battles for the cauldrons required time and resources. Guderian's and Hepner's tanks needed maintenance and replenishment of ammunition. Spare parts for engines did not arrive on time. The personnel had no rest. Second, the frosts. In mid-October, the first serious frost struck. The German army was dressed in summer uniforms because its quartermasters had counted on victory before autumn. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers froze in overcoats not designed for the Russian winter. The third factor, and perhaps the most significant in operational terms, through transfers from the Far East and Siberia, the Soviet side received fresh divisions, which German intelligence had partly missed. Rokossovsky's 16th Army, covering the Volokholamsk direction, received Siberian rifle divisions, men dressed for winter, trained to fight in frost, psychologically unbroken by the summer disasters. They did not know the fear of the Vyazma cauldron. They came from the east and saw the war as a task to be completed, not as a continuous retreat. Among those who stood on the approaches to Moscow in November 41 were men who had gone through the Vyazma cauldron and come out of it. Their biographies are a special slice of military fate. To be caught in one of the most terrible encirclements in the history of wars, to get out, to be assigned to a new unit, to receive a weapon and to stand on the line again. Their experience was specific. They knew that encirclement was not the end, that one could get out of it, that German positions had gaps at night, that the Germans did not fight at night as confidently as during the day. This knowledge was worth more than the regulations. The operational result of the Vyazma operation was recorded by the German side as a complete victory, and by the numbers, it was exactly that. 5 Soviet armies destroyed, the road to Moscow open. Army Group Center reached the Mozhaisk line. By all criteria of military planning, the Germans had achieved the operational objectives of Operation Typhoon in its first phase. Entries in German military journals for October 41 are replete with the word Vernichtungsschlacht, Battle of Annihilation, and triumphant reports on captured equipment. But Operation Typhoon had a second phase. Moscow still had to be taken, and between October and December unfolded the history that is commonly called the Battle of Moscow. And in this history, the Vyazma cauldron turned out to be not the final point, but the beginning. Precisely because the Soviet armies stood their ground to the very end, precisely because the breakthrough took several weeks instead of several days, the German offensive on Moscow reached the immediate approaches to the capital with tank engines running on fumes, with men who had not slept, with a logistical system fraying at every step. The German November offensive, the second thrust on Moscow, unfolded on the 16th of November. By that time, the Soviet side had managed to bring up to the Mozhaisk line precisely those Siberian and Far Eastern divisions that shifted the balance near Volokholamsk and Tula. In the first days of December, the German offensive finally ran out of steam. On the 3rd of December, German units on certain sectors began an unauthorized withdrawal, not by order but because there were no men left. On the 5th of December, Zhukov launched a counterstrike. This became the turning point. Thus, the Vyazma catastrophe was not merely a defeat, it was the price the Soviet side paid for time. Time spent holding the cauldron, on partial breakouts, on ensuring that German infantry divisions spent a month guarding the perimeter instead of advancing. This does not negate the tragedy of hundreds of thousands of people killed or captured. It simply explains the mechanics of how a defeat transitions into a prerequisite for what is later called victory. Stalin never spoke publicly about the Vyazma catastrophe. Post-war Soviet historiography skirted the topic or reduced it to brief paragraphs about the withdrawal to the Mozhaisk line and temporary difficulties. The real casualty figures, the real chronicle of the encirclement, the real price of orders that continued to be carried out even after it had become impossible to fulfill them, all of this was classified or hushed up. The archives on the Vyazma operation began to open only at the end of the Soviet period and continue to be refined. Konev survived the war. He commanded the First Ukrainian Front in the final years of the war, took Berlin in April 1945 together with Zhukov. He received the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union. About the fact that in October 1941 his fate hung by a thread, he wrote briefly and without details in his memoirs. He was a man who had every reason to remember and every reason to remain silent. Zhukov wrote about those days in more detail, but also without particular candor in his assessments. In his memoirs, the Vyazma cauldron is an extremely difficult operational situation that was stabilized, and the self-sacrifice of the troops that pinned down large enemy forces. This language is formally precise and entirely imprecise in substance. In substance, it was a catastrophe, one of the most terrible in terms of the scale of simultaneous losses in the history of the Second World War on any theater of operations. 700,000 to 800,000 people surrounded, the majority captured or killed, 5 armies ceased to exist as combat units within 2 to 3 weeks. This is not a difficult situation. This is a collapse. And yet this collapse was not the end. And here begins the conversation about what military history truly is. Not about victories and defeats in their pure form, but about how one grows out of the other. About the fact that the price paid by soldiers dying in a cauldron often turns out to be a contribution to a victory they themselves will never see. The people who died in the Vyazma forest in October 1941 did not die because they were thrown away meaninglessly. And not only because they were thrown away due to command errors, though errors existed. They also died because the system that sent them to fight had not yet had time to become good enough for the war it had to wage. The Soviet Army of 1941 was not ready for this war. It was becoming ready, through Vyazma, through Kharkov, through Rzhev, through defeats that gradually turned into experience. Experience is costly, paid for with millions of lives. No other military price buys such experience. The debate on whether the Vyazma catastrophe could have been avoided is not over. Some historians point to specific errors by Konev, underestimation of intelligence data, weak flank cover, delayed reaction to the initial strikes. Others object. Given the balance of forces that had developed by the beginning of October, the catastrophe was, if not inevitable, then close to inevitable. The Germans had overwhelming superiority in mobile forces, operated in concentrated columns against a stretched defense, struck at the junctions where defense is always weaker. Even if Konev had correctly interpreted all intelligence reports, he had neither reserves to parry the blow nor time for regrouping. But that is precisely why the question of Konev's guilt is incomplete. The full question sounds different. How did it happen that by October 1941, the Soviet army stood on the approaches to its capital with such a deficit of everything? Men, equipment, ammunition, communications, trained officers, that 5 armies could be encircled and destroyed in 2 weeks? The answer to this question goes much further back than October 1941, to June, to decisions made in the 20s and 30s about the nature of the future war, to the purges of the command staff in 1937 and 1938, to orders prohibiting the preemptive deployment of troops for fear of provoking Germany. The Vyazma catastrophe was the logical outcome of a long chain. The last link in this chain was the order to hold on, which was carried out even when there was no one left to carry it out. The first link was the gap between the map and the ground, a gap that existed in Soviet military planning long before October 1941 and which cost a price difficult to express in numbers. On the 7th of December 1941, exactly 2 months after the completion of the Vyazma encirclement, Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive near Moscow. The Germans began to withdraw. This was the first strategic withdrawal of German troops in the entire campaign of 1941. It meant that the blitzkrieg had failed, that the war would not be short, that years lay ahead. In official Soviet narratives, the battle for Moscow holds the honorable place of the first major victory. The word Vyazma appears rarely and in passing in this narrative. The connection between the two events, between the October catastrophe and the December victory, remains outside the ceremonial description. And this connection is direct. Without Vyazma, there is no December. Without the October defeat, there are no Siberian divisions that managed to take up positions, no German fatigue, no logistical exhaustion of Army Group Center. History is rarely as simple as commonly thought. Victories by themselves, defeats by themselves. More often, one grows out of the other. And those who did not escape the Vyazma cauldron were not merely victims. They were part of an equation, the result of which was written in December 1941 on the approaches to Moscow. It was here, in October 1941, that the reassembly of the Soviet military system began. Not in the sense that is usually discussed, not a reinterpretation of doctrine or a reform of staff structures. A reassembly of the very foundation. It became clear, the war would be long. Holding positions was more important than the outcomes of individual battles. Strict control over commanders was less important than saturating the line with reserves. And all of this was paid for in blood. The Vyazma catastrophe was not merely a military failure. It was a diagnosis of the state of the entire system: intelligence, operational planning, communications, supply. The only thing that worked normally in the Soviet army in the autumn of '41 was the people. Those who held on to orders, did their job, and did not flee when flight would have been the only sensible course of action. However, viewing the Vyazma operations solely through the prism of military mistakes would be incomplete. Vyazma is also the legacy of two opposing systems: The German system built on mobility, decentralization of decisions, and striking at weak points. And the Soviet system built on centralization, reporting upward, and orders from above. One reacted sharply to loopholes. The other waited even with the complete collapse of the front, relying on fanaticism, fear, and terror. One could call this the narrowness of one system and the resilience of the other. But that is a cold observation. At the time, it was viewed differently. The fury of life and death alternated unpredictably, and this perhaps is the most unbearable thing that war does to a person. The last thing that must be said about the role of the common soldier in this story. The average German infantryman guarding the outer perimeter of the pocket did not know what stood inside. He only knew that if a breakthrough were allowed, everything would be in vain. The average Soviet soldier trying to break out of the encirclement did not know where to go. He only knew that to stand still meant to die. Both acted within the limits of what they could. Both paid the same price, their lives. What happened near Vyazma has been studied for decades. Historians count numbers, argue over documents, compare German and Soviet reports. The numbers never match, too many variables. But one thing remains unchanged. Near Vyazma in the autumn of 41, people were laid into the ground. Tens of thousands by the most conservative estimate, perhaps more. It was precisely from them that the army grew which, in the winter of 41, forced the Germans to transition to strategic defense for the first time. It was precisely from them that the Army of the 50th grew, which reached Berlin. What makes defeats irreversible? To answer this question, one must look not at the tactical, but at the systemic level. The Vyazma catastrophe is not a mistake by Konev, nor is it a betrayal by Konev. It is the result of a clash between two systems of military command at a specific point in their development. The German system was ready for this war as early as 1936, starting with Poland. The Soviet system was not. And the gap in readiness in October 1941 was absolutely real. History loves to pose the question of what would have happened if. What would have happened if Stalin had permitted reconnaissance flights deep into the western regions as early as the summer? What would have happened if the Western Front had retreated in the first days of the operation? These questions are meaningless in one sense. Answers to them inevitably lead to the next question, and so on, ad infinitum. This is how military history works. It does not provide answers, it provides lessons. And the lesson of Vyazma in the final analysis was one. War does not end on a map. It ends in what the country that survived or did not becomes.